This is a pocket recorder called Tentacle Sync Track E, and it records audio in 32-bit float. And it's this characteristic that I want to explain more about. Why? Well, because I've had a conversation with a friend of mine the other day in which he explained these things to me in a way that I considered will be very useful to my YouTube audience, so let's talk about it. To talk about bit depth, we first need to define what a bit even is and then build from there. As per Wikipedia, the bit is the most basic unit of information in computing and digital communications. It is the smallest unit of data that a computer can process and store. And it only has two possible states. Either it's 1 or 0, which we can also write down as 2 to the power of 1. We'll get to why this notation is important in a moment. And since we're talking about bits in the audio context, you might be wondering, is 1-bit audio possible? Sure it is. Here's how it sounds. Pretty trippy, right? Back to our bits. Or should I say bit? If we add another bit to it, we now have 4 possible values, or 2 to the power of 2. And if we add one more, it's 2 to the power of 3, and so forth. And if we keep adding bits to our pool, we eventually get to 2 to the power of 16 or 16 bits, which is the first relevant point because this is the bit depth that CD audio uses. You remember CDs, right? Those round, shiny plastic discs that we burned our romantic compilations on ages ago. Anyway, with 16 bits of depth, each sample has just over 65,000 possible values. And in modern audio, there's either 44.1 or 48,000 samples recorded each second. So, if 16 bits of depth work just fine and still does, why did we develop audio processing not only to 24 bits, but all the way up to 32? To understand that, let's first imagine an audio interface which has a 24-bit converter. Actually, let's draw those bits out. And since we haven't assigned anything to them yet, let's mark them with zeros. Without going into details because the reasons are very low level, and when I say low level, I mean how the analog conversion circuitry works, we're just going to blindly accept the fact that each bit of depth adds approximately 6 decibels of dynamic range. For those of you who want to dig deeper, I'll add the link in the description down below. By this formula then, 24 bits means 144 dB of dynamic range. Now, if we look at the specification of the track E listed on the Tentacle Sync website, we see that its dynamic range measures at 110 decibels, which is where most other interfaces also list at, give or take a couple of decibels. But where are the remaining 34 decibels, or if we round them up, 6 bits of data? Well, unfortunately, electronic devices aren't perfect. So we lose those 6 bits to internal or circuitry noise, which means our graphic now looks like this. By the way, I know there's also a characteristic of the device called total harmonic distortion, but we will leave that out for the sake of simplicity, as it doesn't significantly impact the point I'm trying to drive across. If we look at our graphic now, this means we are left with 18 bits of usable range. A normal human conversation usually measures at roughly 60 to 70 decibels, depending on how close the listener or the microphone is. So if we take the higher number, just so we are on the safe side, we're looking at roughly 12 bits of signal. But before we draw those bits to our graphic, you should also know that no room is without its own noise called the ambient noise, and it normally amounts to around 30 dB or 5 bits. This noise is then added to our signal that is being picked up by the microphone, like so. And now we can finally add the above into our original bit allocation, which can be done in multitude of ways. We can do it like this, or like this. So, how do we position our voice plus the room noise on the relevant bits? Easy, by using the gain dial on the device that performs the analog to digital conversion. Of course, the most interesting positions are the two extremes. If you dial it all the way up, you risk clipping the signal, and if you dial it all the way down, you risk bringing up the device's own noise when you crank up the gain in post-production. There is another, in my opinion, even more relevant takeaway here. It's the 6 unused bits we have at our disposal. This means that if we were speaking normally into the microphone, our levels could be at minus 36 decibels when at their highest, and we wouldn't lose any quality or introduce any additional noise into the recording. Most of the modern interfaces have similar performance, and even if it's slightly worse, on average we lose 1 bit or 6 decibels. So, What is the point in all this, you may ask? Well, when starting out with dedicated audio interfaces, most of us get pulled into this flawed thinking that for the best audio quality, we have to pick as close to zero as possible. But that is simply not necessary. Even an affordable audio interface has enough of headroom that you can drop those peaks down to -18 or even lower and not lose any information nor introduce any additional noise. So why then use 30-bit float converters if I just proved to you it's not necessary? Before I answer that, we actually have to look at the float part. You see, 24-bit interfaces aren't float or floating point. They're integer, and in math, an integer basically means a whole number. So between numbers 16 and 24 are 8 values, period. But with floating points, we can describe a certain value in a more scientific notation, where this number can also be expressed and recorded like this. It might sound confusing, no pun intended, but processing audio like this gives us a whopping 1,528 decibels of dynamic range, as opposed to 32-bit integer, which would only give us a measly 192 decibels. Now, what if I tell you that the loudest sound ever recorded on Earth was a volcanic eruption around 140 years ago at 172 decibels? Hopefully, you can now clearly see that 32-bit float is more than enough for, well, anything and everything that makes sound. So why didn't we stop at 32 bits then? Well, because we humans like to mess stuff up. Even in another of my videos, which I'll link to up here, I forgot to set the gain on my interface correctly despite having enough headroom, as I explained earlier. And the result, well, was clipping. But with this tentacle track E here, that will never happen, regardless where I set my gain, because it's a 32-bit float device. Well, it has other qualities as well, so if you'd like me to do a more thorough review, let me know in the comments down below and I'll make a dedicated video about it. While this was a rough explanation of how the bits or bit depth relates to decibels and dynamic range, if you want to learn more on the topic, I highly recommend you go and visit Julian Krause's channel. He's a real nerd when it comes to interfaces and regularly does reviews and comparisons in case you're on the lookout for a new one. Thanks for taking the time to watch this video. If you have any questions, be sure to leave them down in the comments below. And most importantly, if you found any kind of value in it, go ahead and click that like button. See ya!